On December 4th, 1977, a TV special called A Cosmic Christmas aired on CBS. This half-hour special, which tells the story of 3 aliens visiting Earth in search of the true meaning of Christmas, was one of the first major productions of a Canadian animation studio called Nelvana. A Cosmic Christmas caught the attention of George Lucas shortly after it aired, who found himself impressed by the quality of its animation. Based on that, he contacted Nelvana and asked them to produce an animated segment for another holiday special with a science fiction twist, one that you might be a little bit more familiar with.
The Star Wars Holiday Special!
Nelvana's contribution to the Star Wars Holiday Special was a 9-minute cartoon, which was eventually given the title of The Faithful Wookiee or The Story of the Faithful Wookiee. This standalone animated segment was included in the otherwise live-action variety show, framed as an in-universe cartoon watched by Chewbacca's young son in their house. Airing for the first and only time on November 17, 1978, the Star Wars Holiday Special was a project that was created almost entirely for the purpose of reminding people that Star Wars still existed in the time between the original film's release and its sequel 3 years later. George Lucas himself was only involved in the very earliest stages of pre-production, and since its release has tried really hard to distance himself from it.
It came out so bad! I hate it! I hate it! I hate it! I hate it!
George.
But while the Star Wars Holiday Special is looked back on today with nearly universal disdain, you might be surprised to hear that contemporary reviews were surprisingly positive. Starlog magazine called it one of the most ambitious television spectaculars ever attempted by an American network. And The Hollywood Reporter said, "For the most part, the special was an inventive diversion that stood on its own merits." Truthfully, though, they were reviewing it as a 1970s variety show, by which it largely succeeds, and not so much as a Star Wars product, by which it largely does not. And maybe it's redundant at this point to even go into why the Star Wars Holiday Special is so bad, but primarily that comes from things like the baffling choice to center the story around 3 Wookiees who don't speak any English, the awkward and dated nature of the guest stars and musical acts, and the lack of substantial screen time from any of the main Star Wars cast members, despite the fact that they all make minor appearances.
You're like family to me.
Here's what Gary Kurtz, producer of A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, said about it.
It did start out to be a lot better. We had half a dozen meetings with the TV company that was making it. In the end, because of promoting Star Wars and working on the next film, we realized we had no time, and so we just left it to them and just had occasional meetings with them, provided them with access to props and the actors, and that was it. And we were kind of appalled as it got toward airtime. It's exactly what was happening with it. And so everybody just kind of walked away.
But despite all of that, Nelvana's animated short has remained an undeniable bright spot in retrospect, and features the entire main cast reprising their roles in vocal form.
Luke, take R2 with you.
What'd he say? If something has happened to Captain Solo and Chewbacca is alone, you will need me to interpret.
Truthfully, it's one of the only parts of the 90-minute special that feels even a little bit like Star Wars. So I think a lot of people really latched onto it. And when the franchise eventually returned to TV after this disastrous first attempt, it's the only thing from the holiday special that set any kind of real precedent. George Lucas personally suggested the style of the French cartoonist Mobius for the look of the world and the background characters. Later animated Star Wars projects, especially the 2D animated ones, have also paid homage to this aesthetic influence. Mobius himself didn't officially contribute to The Faithful Wookiee, although the artists at Nelvana put in a reference to him with some of this background graffiti. They also found it necessary to stylize the designs and movements of C-3PO and R2-D2, whose stiff live-action metal anatomy wouldn't otherwise translate very well into animation.
Hang on, R2. What about me? I'm going to shake apart.
The resulting rubbery form and C-3PO's facial expressions with blinking eyes have also been carried over into many of the subsequent animated Star Wars projects. Of course, the other notable thing about The Faithful Wookiee is that it's the official debut of the character Boba Fett.
Boba Fett is Darth Vader's right-hand man. I'm afraid this whole adventure has been an Imperial plot.
We'll meet again, friend.
By 1978, Kenner Products, who held the exclusive toy license for Star Wars, were starting to run low on background characters from the original movie from which to mine. So they requested fast-tracking one of the new characters from the still very much in the works Empire Strikes Back to sell toys for.
Boba Fett is not yet available in stores, but you can get him free with 4 proofs of purchase from any Star Wars action figures.
So it's no surprise that George Lucas had so little to do with the Star Wars Holiday Special. He was, frankly, extremely busy at that time and in the years that followed. Lucas was overseeing 2 massively successful film franchises, while simultaneously attempting to establish Lucasfilm Limited as a legitimate studio. But it's also no surprise that the Star Wars Holiday Special was made, and that it was so heavily influenced by studio executives and toy companies. In a lot of ways, the Holiday Special is a perfect example of the Star Wars franchise going through necessary growing pains. And these were challenges that continued even after the release of Return of the Jedi, when George Lucas found himself being pulled in 3 very different directions. On one hand, the strain of producing the most successful film trilogy of all time, with an unprecedented scope and groundbreaking, never-before-seen special effects, well, that had actually taken a pretty big toll on his personal life. Marcia, George's wife and the editor of most of his films to that point, including all 3 Star Wars movies, announced her intention to divorce him in 1982, calling him a workaholic. Their divorce was made official after the release of Return of the Jedi, and after that point, Lucas was, in effect, a single father. But he committed himself to never letting work get in the way of family ever again. When discussing why he wouldn't produce a theatrical sequel to Return of the Jedi, Lucas gave this surprisingly tender explanation. When you have a daughter, it changes things. You can't just put a kid on hold and say, wait, I've got one more picture to do. You just stay tight. You know, she's only going to be 2 once, and she's great. I'm not going to miss it. The second direction that Lucas found himself being pulled in was the need to keep Star Wars as a brand alive even though he was done making movies for a while. It's clear that things like technical innovation were something that were driving a lot of Lucas's work, but that's not something that comes easy or cheaply at all. And Star Wars, quite honestly, was his most reliable and highest paying cash cow. The success of the original movie had given him the capital to start his very own film studio, to innovate in the fields of special effects, sound production and mixing, and eventually non-linear editing and 3D animation. Star Wars was the franchise that paid for all of that, and continuing to strike while the iron was hot could help him fund basically any project that he could ever dream up. But the final source of pressure that was being put on George Lucas in the early 80s was the preciousness that he felt for the franchise he had created. This was a world that had its roots in some of the most formative experiences of his childhood. It was a script that was nearly a decade in the making by the time it finally arrived in theaters in 1977. In other words, Star Wars wasn't something that he could ever just pimp out to someone else for a quick buck. He had been burned by things like the Star Wars Holiday Special, which clearly did not reflect his intentions for the world and the characters, and so he vowed to be personally involved whenever Star Wars did return. But to be clear, that didn't mean that there was no place for marketability in Star Wars. Again, the reason that they were pushing Boba Fett so hard was motivated by advanced toy sales, and the inclusion of the teddy bear-like Ewoks in Return of the Jedi has long been rumored to have been done for exactly the same reason. And so the solution that satisfied all 3 of these conflicting desires was clear. George Lucas needed to get on board with Star Wars being on TV. And his first attempt at doing that was Caravan of Courage, an Ewok adventure, which premiered in November of 1984 on ABC. Unlike the Holiday Special, which had been done mostly without his involvement, Lucas was heavily involved in the production of Caravan of Courage, conceiving of the story and acting as an executive producer. So that he wouldn't have to travel overseas again, the TV movie was shot in Marin County, California, practically in his own backyard. Even the concept of the movie, a young girl who befriends a tribe of Ewoks, was inspired by his relationship with his daughter Amanda.
I think they want to be our friends.
Get your hands over.
In Caravan of Courage, the main character, named Sindel Tawani, crash lands with her family on the forest moon of Andor.
I got Ewok.
Along with her brother Mace and their new Ewok friends, she embarks on a journey to rescue her parents from a creature called the Gorax, encountering other monsters and creatures in the forest along the way. The most prominently featured Ewok is Wicket, who was played again by Warwick Davis, reprising his role from Return of the Jedi. By all accounts, the production of Caravan of Courage sounds like the most fun that anyone ever had making a Star Wars movie. In contrast with the theatrical films, which were made under intense scrutiny, the Ewok adventure took things back a step, incorporating more primitive stop motion, along with forced perspective shots and glass matte paintings. These were filmmaking tricks that had been around for decades at that point. Lucas apparently told production designer Joe Johnston to just, quote, go out there and have some fun. And that's great. The Ewok adventure was a far cry from the heart-pulsing action and spectacle of the theatrical films, but its simple fairy tale story was moderately well received. But importantly, it proved to Lucas that there was a place for Star Wars on TV on his terms. He said, I hadn't done any TV, and it was a chance to use many people in the company who hadn't had much experience with live action production and experiment a little. The economics of TV are vastly different than the economics of film. It was done for very little money. Production soon began on a second Ewoks TV film, which would debut almost exactly 1 year later.
Get down this way. Trouble, big trouble.
Initial plans for this sequel, eventually titled The Battle for Endor, focused around the entire Tawani family from the first movie, all together on a brand new adventure. However, after watching the Shirley Temple film Heidi with his daughter, Lucas suggested taking inspiration from that story, which centered around a young orphan who lives with a curmudgeonly old man in the woods. But to map that story onto the universe established in the first Ewoks movie, there was a problem. Actually, there were 3 problems. Those being Sindel's mother, father, and brother. Lucas was insistent, though, and the opening few minutes of Battle for Endor show Sindel literally becoming an orphan at the hands of 7-foot-tall marauders and an evil sorceress who can transform into a raven. Plans for a third and final Ewoks TV movie ultimately fizzled out, but references to concepts that were created in the 2 of them have continued to occasionally resurface in more modern Star Wars stories. And at the same time that he was working on the live-action Ewoks movies, George also returned to the idea of telling Star Wars stories with another medium. He said, I've always been interested in animation. And again, it's a chance to experiment with ideas and new people and Star Wars characters. The Star Wars world is much easier to deal with in animation. You can be much more flexible in the development of ideas. In 1984, pre-production began on not 1, but 2 animated series set in a galaxy far, far away. Both premiering on September 7th, 1985, Star Wars Ewoks and Star Wars Droids, The Adventures of R2-D2 and C-3PO, were produced by Nelvana, the very same studio who had been responsible for that animated segment in the holiday special. The shows were even previewed the day before on an ABC Saturday sneak peek hosted by Tony Danza.
Hello, 3PO. How are you today? R2? What was that, R2?
George Lucas was an executive producer on both Ewoks and Droids, which aired back-to-back in a programming block on the ABC network. The shows initially premiered to heavy competition, going up against Muppet Babies on CBS and The Smurfs on NBC. Each pair of episodes cost approximately $600,000 to produce, which was considerably more expensive than most other animated series on TV at the time. It's clear that the subjects that were chosen for Star Wars Ewoks and Star Wars Droids, which were, obviously Ewoks and Droids, were chosen for 2 equally important reasons. For one, both sets of characters were incredibly popular with young children, and there were, of course, corresponding Kenner action figure lines for both series. In addition to that, both C-3PO and R2-D2 and the Ewoks were ancillary enough to the main Star Wars story that George Lucas wouldn't have to tiptoe around them if he ever made more Star Wars movies. And that's something that became sort of a blessing and a curse. There was significant pressure from writers on both series to eventually fold in more conventional Star Wars iconography and characters, but Lucas was pretty firmly against that idea. The closest to the main feature films that things ever got in Ewoks was in the second to last episode of the entire series. The episode, titled Battle for the Sunstar, depicts the very first arrival of the Empire to the forest moon of Endor.
I cannot believe there is anything on that backwater planet that could be of use to the Galactic Empire.
Continuity references in its sister series, Droids, were a little bit more common. The bounty hunter IG-88 is mentioned in one episode and appears in the following one as a guest antagonist. There's also an episode that features Boba Fett, voiced again by Don Franks, who originated the character in the holiday special.
Boba Fett.
After this, we are settled, Size From. After this, I owe you nothing.
On the other hand, references back to droids in later Star Wars feature films are also relatively plentiful, primarily in the prequel trilogy, which shares a few behind-the-scenes crew members and was produced more than a decade later. The name of the pod race in The Phantom Menace is actually an homage to something from this 1980s cartoon, which features an event called the Bunta Race at the climax of the Boba Fett episode.
That isn't the half of it. I'm in the Boont race tomorrow. What?
There's also this circular bike that's used in an episode, which is a design that was at least partly recycled for General Grievous's bike in Revenge of the Sith. And the final one, which admittedly might just be a coincidence, is the villain of the third story arc, who is named Kybo Ren. Yeah, this guy's name is Kybo Ren, like with a B.
Aha! Quick gin to a ship. Damasan has not seen the last of Kybo Ren.
Both Star Wars Ewoks and Star Wars Droids feature theme songs that were written and performed by well-established musicians. Ewoks features a composition by American blues musician Taj Mahal and his wife. The theme song for Droids was titled In Trouble Again and was performed by Stuart Copeland of the Police. And while the two shows did air as a pair for 13 weeks starting in September of 1985, they were written and produced independently of each other with their own crews. When asked about the difference between the two series from an animation standpoint, layout artist Brian LeMay said, "The lack of emotion in the characters in the Droid series. They always seem to have the same emotion on their face, whereas the Ewoks, they had lots of emotion. Happy, sad, surprised, angry, the whole range." Ewoks was set about 6 months before Return of the Jedi, and further elaborates on the characters set up in that movie and in the Caravan of Courage.
Pizza, and I thought it was hot outside. Oh. Unnecessary discomfort, Chirpa. Gundalo Gray.
As an executive producer, George Lucas pointed the series' writers and directors towards the work of Joseph Campbell, and even sent them to some of the locations where Return of the Jedi was filmed for inspiration. Writer Paul Dini said Lucas emphasized to him how important it was for the Ewoks to have a sense of community. The Ewok Wicket was again chosen to be the main character, voiced initially by Jim Henshaw.
What about you, Wicket? I don't know. What if we get in trouble?
The half-hour episodes were almost always standalone adventures, usually with Wicket and his friends encountering some stupid villain in the forest like the Dulocs or Morag the Witch, and overcoming their challenges with the power of friendship or whatever. Droids, on the other hand, had the same first season episode count, but that series was broken up into story arcs consisting of 4 or 5 episodes each. Each arc begins with R2-D2 and C-3PO finding a new master.
We so desperately need a master.
Take it easy, 3PO. You've got one. 2.
Getting tangled up in their lives for a few episodes, and then departing them for one reason or another.
I don't like leaving like this, but it seems to be the only way.
Droids was actually a prequel, set 15 years or so before the original Star Wars, and that was by far the earliest point in the timeline that any official Star Wars content had explored at that time. And again, that obviously meant that characters like Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Princess Leia were off limits. Luckily, they still did have the voice of Anthony Daniels, who played the character C-3PO in live action, and who had also voiced him in The Faithful Wookiee. And that provided some sense of continuity with the films. Daniel says that he was actually initially hesitant to join the series, saying, "I didn't want to do it. I had to be convinced that it was going to be better. I'm no mug. I wouldn't support something just because Lucasfilm was doing it." Really?
My name, you know, is C-3PO. Rapping about space, the new place to go. You can eat all you want and you won't gain a pound because there isn't any weight here like back on the ground.
Daniels did, of course, agree to do the show, although he would apparently often rewrite his dialogue before recording.
Thank the maker. Nothing in protocol programming prepared me for this.
Now, it's clear that both Ewoks and Droids were very much aimed at children, and specifically children of the 1980s, so that makes revisiting them some 4 decades later as an adult kind of a challenge.
R2's jamming their audio amplifiers. Let's go!
Content restrictions under the Reagan administration even forbid the animators from depicting anything that looked like a blaster. So stormtroopers and droids were given these bizarre weapons, and the villains in Ewoks often used a vague forest magic as their source of power.
Not for eating, stupid.
And to be honest, they really dialed up C-3PO's comic antics here, which can be especially grating, even if you have a stomach for him in his more goofy live-action appearances.
This is most uncomfortable. Sir!
Both Droids and Ewoks ended their initial 13-episode run in November of 1985, and both shows did return the next year, albeit in different forms. Rather than give Droids a full second season, Lucasfilm instead opted to produce one double-length special as a kind of finale. This special was titled The Great Heap and aired on June 7th, 1986. And in the grand tradition of Star Wars stories being told in confusing chronological order, The Great Heap is actually a prequel to the third story arc of the series. In other words, the series finale takes place between episodes 9 and 10 of the first season, and details how C-3PO and R2-D2 came to be under the ownership of a guy named Mungo Baobab, who you would have previously seen as their temporary master in the final 4 episodes of the main series. The Great Heap was actually written by Ben Burtt, who's the Oscar-winning sound designer of the original and prequel trilogies, but this special was a major ratings disappointment, and ultimately spelled the end of the Droids animated series. Ewoks, on the other hand, was renewed for a full second season, but was essentially unrecognizable when it returned. The series was actually taken out of Nelvana's hands and produced mainly in-house at Lucasfilm. And when they did that, they actually made some changes to make it even more appealing to very, very young children. First, the title sequence was replaced with all new footage and a much more cheery and upbeat theme song. Several of the voice actors were replaced, as in the case of Denny Delk replacing Jim Henshaw as Wicket.
I think I got it now.
And the other Ewoks, if they were not cut completely, were given dramatically different personalities. The other major difference in the second season was that many of the show's half-hour time slots were broken up into 2 shorter stories instead of just 1. The all-new Ewoks was not as much of a rating success to justify producing it under rising animation costs, and it was unofficially canceled after the season. And just as quickly as it had begun, the brief heyday of Star Wars on TV in the 1980s came to an abrupt end.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
So regular people might say that history repeats itself, but Star Wars fans, we have a different thing that we like to say, right?
It's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
In exactly the same way that dwindling toy sales fast-tracked an animated showcase for Boba Fett, that was also the origin for the next animated Star Wars series. In that case, it was Kenner pressuring Lucasfilm for something new in the original trilogy time period. But in the early 2000s, Hasbro held the Star Wars merchandising license, and they wanted to sell toys from the Clone Wars. So the Clone Wars was first name-dropped in the original Star Wars movie all the way back in 1977.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
But it was kind of a vague and unexplored concept for a couple of decades after that. There's actually a lot of stuff like that in that first movie.
The Imperial Senate.
The Kessel Run.
At times, the Clone Wars were suggested to be some kind of conflict between the Republic and the Mandalorians. There are also references in an early draft of the screenplay for The Empire Strikes Back that indicate that Lando is actually the mournful last surviving member of a batch of clones himself. However, nothing was officially done with the concept of the Clone Wars until the second film in the prequel trilogy, Attack of the Clones, was released in 2002.
Begun. The Clone War has.
And along with that, an entirely new era was opened up, with countless conflicts and worlds to explore. And more importantly, characters who could become action figures. Russian-American animator Genndy Tartakovsky was chosen to spearhead an animated microseries that was a joint idea between Hasbro and Lucasfilm in 2003. And micro-series is exactly the right way to describe this original Clone Wars TV project. Initially pitched as an anthology series where episodes would run no longer than 1 minute, Tartakovsky asked for just a little bit more time. He told Hasbro, "I would love to do it, but 1 minute episodes are basically commercials, so I don't really want to do that. But if we can get at least maybe 3 or 5 minutes, I could see what we could try and do with it." After a consultation with George Lucas, Tartakovsky's team was given the authorization to do exactly that, produce episodes that ran between 3 and 5 minutes long, and explore the galactic conflict from a variety of different angles.
We kind of start the Clone War in one episode, we end it in the next episode, but we never actually see the war. And so by doing the animated series, it was a great opportunity to fill in some of the blanks in the middle where you get to deal with the adventures of the war and all the things that went on during the war, because obviously that's a very fertile ground for exciting storytelling.
It really is by the grace of Tartakovsky that the Clone Wars micro-series that debuted on Cartoon Network in 2003 so undeniably transcends being a series of toy commercials. Along with a couple of key animators from his previous projects, like Samurai Jack and Dexter's Laboratory, Tartakovsky injected his signature action and character design into every single frame. After a preview episode on November 7th, 2003, the remaining 9 episodes of the show's first season were released daily starting on November 10th. This was followed by a second season, airing in a similar pattern starting in March of 2004. Episodes from the second season were, again, no longer than 5 minutes each, and were shown between episodes of other full series on Cartoon Network. And despite its generally anthology-style storytelling, story arcs inevitably occurred. Chapter 6 introduces the character of Asajj Ventress, who wins a gladiatorial-style competition to become Count Dooku's new apprentice. She's then ordered to hunt down Anakin Skywalker, and the two characters confront one another in a dramatic duel on Yavin 4. Previously established characters were primarily voiced by new actors, some of whom had been introduced in the prior year's video game. And many of them, like Tom Kane, James Arnold Taylor, and Corey Burton, would go on to reprise their roles in later animated series. The exception to these new voices is, as you might expect, Anthony Daniels, who was the only live-action actor to reprise his role here in the 2003 Clone Wars series. Because, of course he did.
Traveling alone in a blizzard on an uncharted planet is commonplace for a Jedi, but not a senator.
In another interesting parallel with The Faithful Wookiee, which introduced audiences to Boba Fett a full 1.5 years before he appeared in a movie, the final chapter in Clone Wars Season 2 actually marks the first appearance of General Grievous, some 13 months before the release of Revenge of the Sith. This was a storyline that was actually carried over to the third and final season of Clone Wars, which began airing in March of 2005. And these new episodes marked a major shift in style for the microseries, allowing it to be slightly less micro. Instead of 10 episodes that ran between 3 and 5 minutes, the third season consisted of 5 episodes that ran between 12 and 15 minutes, which is roughly the same total runtime as the first 2 seasons combined. This expanded runtime allowed the series to stretch its wings and tell a more substantial story that directly bridged the gap between episode 2 and the then upcoming episode 3.
I got a phone call that George wanted to talk to me, and they had this idea because they wanted to do more, but he wanted it to tie in directly into episode 3.
It seemed like an honor. You know, he enjoyed the first batch enough to want to be like, hey, let's do some more. And not only that, let's watch you guys animate the opening scroll, basically. We're like, woohoo!
That's one of the great things about these. They're 12-minute episodes, and wow, we could fit 4 times, obviously, as much information. And plus, it directly ties into the third movie, which makes it even more captivating because it's more of a story rather than just episodes of war.
The third season of the Clone Wars micro-series is as good of a direct prequel to Revenge of the Sith as you could hope for. There are dramatic and important character moments throughout these episodes, and we're actually given the opportunity to see dramatizations of some of the changes that do happen between episodes 2 and 3. including C-3PO finally getting his iconic gold plating, Anakin officially becoming a Jedi Knight, and the plight of the Wookiees on Kashyyyk entering into the galactic conflict. The final episode of the series even directly leads into the opening conflict of Revenge of the Sith, with the Chancellor's kidnapping and Anakin and Obi-Wan being summoned back to Coruscant from the Outer Rim sieges.
Coruscant is under siege, and General Grievous has abducted the Supreme Chancellor. You must return immediately.
Tartakovsky's Clone Wars is not fluff, and it does not sheepishly avoid touching on characters and moments from the movies like Ewoks and Droids did. It's actually a brilliant example of multimedia storytelling and a strong sign of things to come. Revenge of the Sith premiered in theaters just 2 months after the last episode of Clone Wars, and appeared to be the end of theatrical Star Wars movies. But just like the last time that Lucas completed work on a Star Wars trilogy, he quickly turned his attention back to the small screen. Work began on 2 simultaneous projects to continue telling stories in the Star Wars universe, and both of them were announced by George Lucas during a Q&A at Star Wars Celebration 3 in 2005. One of them was a potential live-action series set during the era between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, and was tentatively titled Star Wars Underworld.
Then I'm working on a spin-off series. It's not with the main characters, but it's with other characters that have appeared in the series. And it's going to be a live-action series.
Underworld never got past the development stage, although apparently 50 scripts were fully written, and these scripts had stories about the rebellion, the empire, the scum and villainy of the criminal underworld on Coruscant. There was apparently even a script written that would explore the world of underground pod racing, and would center around the character of Thal Jobin, who's this guy from Star Wars Droids. Reportedly, Daniel Logan had also agreed to reprise his role as Boba Fett, and Darth Vader was planned for a 2-episode arc where he crushed a growing rebellion on Coruscant. Anthony Daniels would have probably been in the show too, let's be honest. The project actually got so close to becoming a reality that Lucasfilm even produced a demo reel in 2010.
You two move along. This area is threat level orange. Move along.
This test footage was shot on a green screen soundstage with almost no physical sets. Impressively though, all of the backgrounds had been created ahead of time and were viewable as real-time rendered footage by camera operators. And that kind of experimental production style would have eliminated some of the guesswork that's traditionally associated with digital sets. Unfortunately, it was simply too expensive to produce a weekly series this way in 2010, although George Lucas was hopeful that as time passed and technology improved, eventually a live-action Star Wars series with a cinematic scope would be possible. We are looking for a different technology that we can use that will make it economically feasible to shoot the show. Right now, it looks like the Star Wars features, but we have to figure out how to make it at about 1/10 of the cost of the features because it's television. We are working towards that, and we continue to work towards that. We will get there at some point. In the meantime, the second Star Wars TV project that Lucas conceived of was an animated continuation of Genndy Tartakovsky's Clone Wars micro-series.
I am Obi-Wan Kenobi, your new master.
I'm at your service, Master Kenobi, but I'm afraid I've actually been assigned to Master Skywalker.
What?
For this next iteration of the Clone Wars, Lucas tapped another of TV animation's rising stars. This time it was Dave Filoni, director of many episodes in the acclaimed series Avatar: The Last Airbender in its first season. Filoni was the supervising director of the second Clone Wars series, distinguished from its predecessor in print with the addition of the in its title. Filoni initially pitched the idea of a band of centralized characters, including 2 smugglers, 2 Jedi, and a Gungan, who would all travel around the galaxy together in a centralized spaceship, not unlike the Millennium Falcon. It's clear that this pitch was made under the assumption that Lucas would continue to prefer that if it were long-running, Star Wars ancillary material should be tangential to the main Star Wars storyline, exploring new characters and new planets, and not anything that he had dealt with in the films themselves. But it's very clear that Lucas had a change of heart. He had been won over by the commitment to continuity that Genndy Tartakovsky's Clone Wars had shown, and felt that the future of Star Wars TV should embrace the idea of a shared universe. And that's exactly what The Clone Wars did. After a theatrically released pilot movie, which was really just 4 TV episodes stitched together, The Clone Wars ran for 5 seasons on Cartoon Network, and explored a variety of characters in the time period between episodes 2 and 3. Some of these characters were new, but a lot of them had appeared in the live-action films. And while reactions to the series were initially mixed, with critics citing stiff animation and juvenile humor,
Where'd they go? Whoa, 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 whoa!
the Clone Wars continued to grow in popularity each season. And while the 2003 micro-series was a fun, if inessential bridge between episodes 2 and 3, the 2008 Clone Wars half-hour series became the defining Star Wars text for an entire generation of kids. Original characters like Ahsoka Tano, Cad Bane, and the various clone troopers earned their place in the pantheon of great Star Wars characters. And the ones from the movie, like Anakin Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, even Jar Jar Binks, were given new depth and complexity in this long-form storytelling format. Unfortunately, Lucas and Filoni's plan for the Clone Wars was cut short when the former sold the rights to the franchise to the Walt Disney Company in 2012. As part of their bid to shift focus away from the divisive prequel trilogy and expanded universe era, Disney abruptly canceled the Clone Wars, with dozens of episodes still in various stages of production. Around that same time, they officially decanonized almost every other piece of Star Wars media that was not one of the 6 live-action films, including every single TV movie and series up to and including Tartakovsky's Clone Wars. Still, recognizing the fan reverence for this new Clone Wars, and the fact that Lucas himself was so directly involved in its production, it was one of the few bits of Star Wars to survive that massive purge. Dave Filoni was given the opportunity to create a new animated show, which was Star Wars Rebels, and he recycled a version of his early Clone Wars pitch to tell stories with a more centralized cast of characters there. 13 Clone Wars episodes that were actually fully complete by the time that the series was canceled eventually aired as part of a truncated 6th season on Netflix in 2014. But with Filoni and Lucasfilm's attention apparently solely focused on Star Wars Rebels, it seemed like the Clone Wars had officially run its course. Until a 10-year anniversary panel at San Diego Comic-Con, where it was announced that the series would return for one final season. The 7th season of The Clone Wars, which aired on Disney Plus in 2020, did not just consist of completed versions of episodes that had been left unfinished by the show's original cancellation, although that did happen as well. Instead, Filoni used the benefit of hindsight to reimagine what a final season of the show should be, pulling from old material and some new. He said, "I think that the biggest thing for me is how do we make this show better? And I think that means examining all the work we had done, the work we were planning on doing, and also trying to honor the work of so many people that were in the middle of making stuff." This belated final season of The Clone Wars features a previously unfinished story arc revolving around a group of clones called the Bad Batch, a series of episodes showing Ahsoka encountering the Pike Syndicate, and a final arc depicting the Siege of Mandalore, which is the closest that any Star Wars TV project had ever gotten to the main films. Always intended to be the series finale, even during its original production, this final arc crosses over with some of the pivotal events from Revenge of the Sith, showing them from the perspective of the show's original characters. And an epilogue in the final episode takes place years after the Clone Wars have ended, and finally gave fans a definitive and moving end to the story that was started 12 years earlier. This final season of The Clone Wars is fascinating to me because it officially concludes the pre-Disney era of Star Wars storytelling, but it also exists very firmly in it. And meanwhile, innovations in virtual stage production have finally allowed George Lucas's dream of near cinematic quality Star Wars TV series to become a reality. And the medium of television, which at its inception had been profoundly embarrassing and purely a ploy to push merchandise, has now become, arguably, the most successful conduit for modern Star Wars storytelling. The Mandalorian brought Star Wars fans together in a way that most people thought would never happen again. Andor raised the bar, bringing prestige TV-level writing, performance, and direction to the franchise. And even a show like Visions allows a diverse group of international animation studios to explore the Star Wars universe like never before. To tie a neat little bow on this history of Star Wars on TV, just about every previous TV movie, series, and micro-series, which again had all been made non-canon under Disney's ownership, were actually added to their streaming service library in 2021. You can find all of that stuff under the Star Wars Vintage Collection banner. So now, with the click of a button, you can revisit the Clone Wars' humble beginnings as short, stylistic bursts of action. You can try to stomach your way through Ewoks or Droids or the Caravan of Courage. In fact, you can even watch The Story of the Faithful Wookiee, the isolated cartoon from the holiday special, which is still, to this day, the only portion of it that has ever been released officially. And that's significant, because on some level, I think Lucasfilm knows what an important piece of Star Wars history that really is. It was the first time, but certainly not the last, when someone didn't know what to do with Star Wars, so they said, I don't know, let's make something for TV.